We call them the greatest generation, and leave it at that. The framing is so complete, so sealed, that it stops most people from asking the more interesting question, not what they did, but what it did to them. Because the generation born between 1901 and 1927 didn't emerge from the Depression and World War II as heroes. They emerged as people whose nervous systems had been permanently recalibrated by catastrophe. And the world they built, every institution, every norm, every unspoken rule, was built by those recalibrated minds. Understanding them isn't just history, it's an explanation for half the things that still confuse us about the modern world. To understand this generation's psychology, you have to understand what happened in October 1929 with actual specificity, not as an abstraction. By 1933, 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. Not uncomfortable, not struggling, unemployed. Banks didn't fail gradually, they collapsed overnight. You could go to sleep with your family's savings intact and wake up to nothing, literally nothing. The FDIC didn't exist yet. There was no backstop, no guarantee, no floor. If you grew up between ages 5 and 15 during the early 1930s, your brain was in its most formative period during the single most destabilizing economic event in American history. Psychologists now understand that early life exposure to unpredictable scarcity produces lasting changes in how the brain evaluates risk and resources. The technical term is scarcity mindset. What it actually felt like was this: you saved everything, every piece of string, every rubber band, every glass jar. Not because you were neurotic, because your nervous system had learned at a cellular level that abundance is temporary and loss arrives without warning. Here's what nobody tells you about that era. There was no framework for processing what was happening. No therapy, no mental health language, no cultural permission to say, "I am not okay." You worked, you provided, you did not complain. The stoicism everyone now romanticizes wasn't nobility, it was the only available coping strategy. When there's no language for suffering, you don't process it, you bury it and keep moving. This created an entire generation of emotionally sealed adults. Not cold people, sealed people. They loved their families with ferocity. They just couldn't say it, couldn't show it. The circuits for emotional expression had been routed entirely into action. You showed love by showing up, by fixing things, by working double shifts so your kid could go to college. Vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was a luxury they'd never been able to afford and had stopped being able to imagine. Here's the central contradiction that explains almost everything about this generation. They were the people most defined by powerlessness, and they became the most control-obsessed cohort in American history. When you've experienced true helplessness at a formative age, one of two things happens. You accept that the world is random and uncontrollable, or you dedicate your entire existence to ensuring you're never that helpless again. The Depression generation chose the second path with an almost religious intensity. They didn't just want security, they wanted systems, predictability, institutions that held. This is why they built what they built. The New Deal hadn't just saved them, it had proven something staggering. Government, functioning correctly, could be a floor, could prevent the floor from dropping out entirely. So they trusted it, expanded it, built the interstate highway system, the GI Bill, Social Security. Not out of ideology, out of the bone-deep memory of what happened when nothing held. Idle time was intolerable to them, not because they were puritanical, though the cultural framing helped, because their nervous systems had learned that motion equals survival. During the Depression, you worked or you starved. That equation got hardwired so deep that even in 1955, even with a steady job and a house in the suburbs, stopping felt dangerous, felt like tempting something. This is where the 40-hour workweek paradox lives. They fought hard for labor protections and then systematically ignored them in their own lives. They took pride in never leaving early, never calling in sick, never admitting exhaustion. The work wasn't just work, it was proof. Proof they weren't the person on the breadline anymore. Proof they'd outrun the worst version of their past. Then came the 1950s. And something genuinely strange happened that historians underestimate. The generation that had survived scarcity suddenly found itself in the middle of the greatest peacetime economic expansion in American history. GI Bill mortgages, refrigerators, televisions, cars. They didn't know how to process abundance. The same neural pathways that had learned to hoard and conserve now had to reckon with a culture of consumption. Most of them landed in an uneasy middle. They accumulated, but they couldn't quite relax into it. The basement was still stocked with canned goods. The savings account was still padded beyond any rational need. You could take the person out of the depression, but you couldn't take the depression out of the person. Their children, the boomers, grew up watching this and understood almost none of it. They saw the material comfort and missed the psychological subtext entirely. They didn't know their parents' silence wasn't distance. They didn't know the savings account was armor. They just knew something was withheld, and they spent the 1960s in open revolt against a restraint they'd never been given the context to understand. The institutions this generation built are inseparable from their trauma. Every redundancy, every regulation, every just-in-pace system built into American infrastructure reflects a mind that had experienced total systemic failure and was determined never to be caught unprepared again. The problem is, institutions designed by trauma often outlast the original conditions. What looks like prudence in 1945 looks like bureaucratic paralysis by 1985. They handed their children a world with more structural stability than any generation in history had ever inherited, and no emotional vocabulary for understanding what it had cost. No stories, no explanation, just the instruction, implicit and total. Do not waste what we built. Don't let the floor drop out again. They're fading now, the last of them, past 90, past memory. And what's left is the architecture, the systems and institutions and cultural reflexes they built from the wreckage of the 1930s, trying to engineer a world where no child would ever pull their savings from a bank and find it empty. They built a world designed never to feel that helpless again, and then handed it to children who had no idea what it cost. Think back to Sunday dinners at your grandparents' house. Did they ever once complain about what they went through, or did you only understand the weight of it after they were gone?